Welcome back. Today we are in Mark 3, verses 20 through 35. This is the first example of a very common uh, literary structure in Mark. We call it the Markan sandwich or an inclusio. This is where Mark starts off with one story and then interrupts that story in order to tell something that is thematically linked to the first story, and then comes back to the first story to conclude the entire episode. So in this one, we are going to have Jesus being confronted by his mother and brothers. Then we are going to have Jesus being confronted by the scribes, and then coming back to that first story of Jesus being confronted by his mother and brothers to wrap everything up so that we have a better understanding of both Jesus as a person and what his purpose was. So to begin with, we see that Jesus is very popular. In verse 20, this is Jesus is riding high. He has healed many people, thrown out many demons, and he is now attracting what Mark calls throngs or multitudes, some of your translations might say. This is not simply the little crowds that Mark has been talking about up to this point. This is a major crowd. He is being overwhelmed, inundated by people to the point where we get the impression that at some times in Jesus' life, he could not really rest because the crowds were just incessant, and he just had to be doing something for them all the time. And that is why in the previous section he had set up the 12 disciples to go out and be his auxiliaries in the world, but he is still overwhelmed by the work. Jesus' mother and brothers get word of this, and they come to rescue him from it. Now, it is possible that they are concerned about something like fatigue or burnout, but the gospel tells us that they come because they think that he needs to be confined. They think he's gone mad. They think he is out of his mind in some way. And so that is the first little section. Jesus is overwhelmingly popular, but his own family seems to think that there's something wrong. And then Mark interrupts that story to tell us that the scribes also come down from Jerusalem. Now, we have met scribes before. These are the experts in the Bible. These are the individuals probably aligned with the Pharisees, in the Pharisees' own camp, but these are the professional scholars. They are the ones who know the scriptures the best. They know the traditions the best. These are the ones that you call in for a fight, and they have come in specifically to undermine Jesus's practice, his ministry. They have come down not to hear Jesus as we had earlier. Earlier scribes were there. They were interacting with Jesus, but you kind of got the feeling that those scribes were there to hear his side and understand who he is. These scribes have come down from Jerusalem. They have been sent on a mission, and that mission is to undermine Jesus and his power. And so what they do, the way they choose to undermine him, is by saying that he throws out demons by the power of Beelzebub. Now, Beelzebub is mentioned in 2 Kings. This character was a deity worshipped in and around Israel at the time of 2 Kings. It roughly translates, near as I can get to it, is something like Lord of the Flies or Lord of the Flying Creatures. This is just a title. Baal means Lord. Zubub is something to do with flying. So you have this Lord of the Flying Ones that the scribes are accusing Jesus of using in casting out demons. Now, Jesus's answer really skews our line of thinking very often, but this is not an unreasonable claim by the scribes, because it was assumed that unlike the order that God wanted to create, that was fairly even with all humans equal in God's sight. They're all created in God's image, and so they're all equal in God's sight, and they're all equal in God's what we say economy, that is society. In Jewish thought, demons had a hierarchy. That is, a high-ranking demon could tell a low-ranking demon what to do. And what the scribes are accusing Jesus of is literally creating a deal with the devil, a high-ranking demon. And this high-ranking demon is giving Jesus power over low-ranking demons. And so what Jesus is going out and doing is exorcising people who are possessed by low-ranking demons by the power of a high-ranking demon. That's their accusation. Jesus, though, rebuffs it with the idea of, why would Satan do that? Now, we can make some claims of why Satan might do that, why demons might do that. If you read C.S. Lewis's great book, Screwtape Letters, you do see that demons, while they, in that book, they work together to some extent, they generally work together only because it benefits the individual demons. They'll play nice as long as it benefits them. That's the kind of the mentality that we need to think of when we think about this. But Jesus is going to say, what does it benefit them? Why would Satan cast out Satan? Why would a house divide itself? Jesus sees this, even evil, as much more unified and much more driven to oppose God as a unified block. And so what Jesus is going to say is, I am not casting out demons with demonic power. I am going in and binding the strong man and taking away the people who have been possessed by him. This is not to say that Satan has power over the earth. This is not to say that Satan is somehow ruler. This is not to say that Satan has control. It is to say that Satan has forcibly taken some elements of the earth, and Jesus is taking them back. So we need to be very cautious in how we approach the idea of demons. Number one, because we don't have a lot of information. And number two, because we don't want to make them seem any more powerful than they are. We want to give them the appropriate attention, and that can be very difficult. So what Jesus is doing is he is saying, I have not been working with demons. Instead, I am the one who subdues demons. I am the one who takes away their power. I take away their structure. I am the one who is casting them out so that God can reign and rule. Now, while that argument might not be any more powerful necessarily than the Pharisees the scribes' argument, they're in many ways equal arguments, except that when somebody speaks and says, I am trying to do this for God, we should at least give them some benefit of the doubt, and we should listen. And that's kind of what happens with Jesus. He makes this claim that he is working on God's side, and there's not much that can be answered to that. Now, the other part of this specific paragraph that is really difficult for a lot of people is, here we have mention of what so many have called the unpardonable sin. And this is an unfortunate categorization, because Jesus is never talking about a sin that cannot be forgiven. He never talks about a sin that cannot be forgiven. And I know a lot of people who have really wrestled with, can I commit this unpardonable sin that God cannot or will not forgive? And that is not what Jesus is talking about. What Jesus is saying is that there is blasphemy. That is making light of God's position and name, and that kind of blasphemy can be forgiven. What won't be forgiven is the other kind of blasphemy. There's two elements to the charge of blasphemy. One is that you are in some way mocking God, and in that, Jesus is saying that can even be forgiven. That will be forgiven. But what won't be forgiven is when you ascribe what God is doing to the wrong actor. In other words, God works in this world and you are saying that wasn't God, that was a demon. That wasn't God, that was whatever. When you do that, it's not that God cannot or will not or does not desire to forgive. God desires to forgive all sins, according to 1 Timothy. God can forgive all sins because all sins are simply a breach in relationship with God. What Jesus is saying is that when you attribute God's power to the wrong elements, what you are doing is blinding yourself to God's power. You're blinding yourself to God's presence. And when you willfully blind yourself to God's presence, well, then you are not going to be forgiven because you don't know you're in the wrong. So what Jesus is saying isn't that God cannot or will not or does not desire to forgive. What Jesus is saying is that when you willingly blaspheme God, as in accredit the wrong entity for God's work, what you are going to do is make it impossible for you to see God's presence anywhere in the world. And then how is God supposed to forgive you when you can't even recognize God's forgiveness and what God is doing? So it is not God will not. It's that you are putting yourself in a position where you literally cannot accept the forgiveness that God wants to give you. So that is what we have to worry about here. Not that God cannot forgive, but that we would put ourselves in the wrong position, the way the scribes have, who are coming down, insulting Jesus, and not willing to accept that God has worked through him. So that's where the scribes are. Then we get back to Jesus' family. And Jesus' family comes to him and says, hey, you need to come with us, or they want to, but the crowds kind of prevent him. And when Jesus is told that his family is out there to see him, Jesus responds in a strange way. He's told, your mother and your brothers are here, and they want to talk to you. Now, we know that Mary and Jude and James ended up following Jesus. We do not know anything about the other named brothers, that is Joseph and Simon. We don't know anything about them other than a one verse where they're mentioned by name. But we do know that James and Jude become leaders in the church. We know that James becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem, that his sons after him become leaders in the church of Jerusalem. We know that Mary followed Jesus, and we know that Jude ended up following Jesus and becoming a leader in the church of Jerusalem. So these individuals, again, they do not recognize who Jesus is at this time, much like the disciples. What we are trying to, again, we said it in the last video. What Mark is trying to do is show the human side of these people who would have been very much revered by the early church. He wants the early Christians to say, wow, these people are just like me. They've grown, they've learned, they've matured, they've become closer to Jesus. They had to go through their ups and downs with him, and they had to gradually learn who Jesus is. I can be just like them. So that's one of the things that Mark wants us to see. Now, given that, we should also notice that what Jesus does in response to being told his mother and his brothers are outside, he says, who is my brother? Who is my mother? These around who do God's will are my mother and my brothers and my sisters. Now, this element of adding sisters is big. It doesn't seem like it to us, but it is big, because the word for brother in Greek is gender inclusive. It includes it can include men and women. So, when Jesus is told his brothers are outside, it probably means literally his male relatives who are the sons of either his mother, father, or both. So, Jesus is told your mother is outside, your brothers are outside. But when Jesus comments, he does not have to include sisters. When he says, who is my mother, who are my brothers, it is all that do God's will. He actually is saying he's including men and women together. He does not have to say sisters. So why does he? Especially since the balance would have been better if he would have responded, my mother and my brothers, if he would have responded with the language that was told to him. Why would he add sisters? This is one of those subtle elements where Jesus and the early church after him are raising the standard for how people thought of women. In Roman culture, in Greco-Roman culture, it was very much a patriarchal society, very much a hierarchical society. Women had no place. Now we can talk from our 20th century, 21st century mindset. Why doesn't the Bible go further and just and promoting women? Well, frankly, if Jesus had gone further, nobody would have listened to him. So using subtlety to promote his cause is far better than using straightforward language, because the subtlety will allow people to listen without listening. It will allow them to hear what he's saying. It will allow them to hear the words, but the more they think about the implications, they will change. But if he comes right out and says what he means, they won't give him the time of day. It's exactly what we face today in our modern world, where so often we meet up against brick walls because we don't know how to subtly change people over time and change their opinions. Jesus is trying to change a culture over time. And so he uses something subtle where he adds in this word sisters, intentionally giving a space to women, because now nobody can say that he didn't include them. If he would have just said the word for brothers, we could have made the argument, as we do in other places, well, women are included, it's gender inclusive. But you have to want to see that. Like when Paul uses the word brothers, when he opens up letters or addresses the Christians, you have to recognize that he would have been addressing all Christians, so obviously it includes women. But when Jesus says this, there is no denying what Jesus said. So it's a subtle way to include women without having to be ostracized for what would have been a completely unrealistic picture in the world around him. It allows us to grow and develop without being accosted. So anyway, that is Mark chapter 3. If you have any questions or comments, as always, you can drop me a comment. I would love to hear from you, hear what you're learning, what you're studying. Hopefully these videos are helping you. And if I can do anything more for you, let me know. God bless.